Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there to learn how to find, maintain, and grow long-term sponsorship relationships. If you want to find out more, please visit the Vaucher Analytics website and use the navigation links at the top right hand of the screen. Okay, so yeah, that's a great segue into this because motorsport sponsorship is big business. In F1, we just found out that MasterCard signed a deal with McLaren for something like $100 million to be the title sponsor. I've also read that Cadillac F1 is looking to take in about $70 to $80 million for title sponsorship. And then just prior to that, Williams also signed a big money deal with Atlassian. But hold on a second, that's F1. That's not motorsport sponsorship. F1 is the premier racing series in the world, and so it enjoys a lot of these big dollar amounts, but it's not always the case for motorsport. And in fact, those sponsorship dollars can be a lot smaller. So I want to talk about another paradigm in motorsport, moving away from the current one to what I see as being the next step in making sustainable racing and race teams. Now, I know this is going to sound a little strange because I just asked you to visit the Vaucher Analytics website to find out about the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator. And right up front, this is not about eliminating sponsorship completely. It's about finding another way of building a solid foundation within motorsports and racing. So with that, let's just get right into it. And this is going to be a multi-part series. So this is talking about racing's second revolution. And part one in that series is why motorsport racing teams must move beyond sponsorship. Let's get started. Motor racing has gone through several phases since its start at the end of the 19th century. First, cars being cutting-edge technology at the time, racing was a hobby for the aristocracy, who self-funded their exploits and, unfortunately, sometimes their catastrophes. Sometime later, not until 1968 in fact, Formula One teams introduced sponsor-influenced liveries to help fund their racing operations. Incidentally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it was tobacco companies setting the stage for this new paradigm. Nevertheless, the teams being sponsored were still in what we might call the garagiste phase. That's to borrow a term from Enzo Ferrari. And if teams needed money from sponsors, it was because they were running on a shoestring and their operations reflected it. It wasn't until the early 1980s, under the influence of Ron Dennis, McLaren ushered in the age of motor racing that we see today, when teams became highly professionalized in search of the ultimate goal, becoming as attractive as possible to sponsors. And again, Big Tobacco led the way, as Ron Dennis worked very closely at the time with Marlboro to codify a lot of the things that we take for granted, such as sponsor placement in different parts of a race car. Ron Dennis created the economic playing field for the races that we enjoy today, with garages looking far more like high-tech laboratories than dirty factories. But other than things looking much more professional in 2025 than they did in 1968, it's still the same motorsport business model. So the thing with sponsorship is that it's just like a free lunch. There's no such thing. In racing, there's Formula One and then there's everything else. But even in F1, the richest championship in the world, the current business model is precarious. Consider that in 2023, Williams, with no factory backing yet still riding the post-COVID Drive to Survive wave, lost over 84 million British pounds. This comes down to high costs, certainly, but also limited opportunities to generate racing team revenue. You have prize money. So in F1, teams earn payments from the secretive Concord Agreement based on results and history within F1. There's licensing revenue, and a small share from F1's centralized licensing, merchandise, and games goes back to the teams, and that is also governed by the Concord Agreement. And then, of course, there's sponsorship. So this is the biggest and most visible revenue source, split between commercial sponsorship, so it's going to be logos on cars and activations, and then modern day patronage. So this is basically what I'm calling it. And this is going to be private equity investors. And yet, even with F1's billions in annual revenue, several teams have only survived because they were able to attract private equity lifelines, and over time, some teams have in fact not made it. Outside F1, for instance, in IndyCar, WEC, IMSA, or GT racing, finance has become really stretched because prize money and licensing are comparably negligible. Not everyone is F1 after all. If you don't have OEM support, sponsorship is effectively your only oxygen. If a sponsor cuts back or disappears, the cycle starts all over again. This is the fundamental problem. How sponsorship looks or is activated is, of course, going to follow Ron Dennis's playbook and be much more polished than it was in the 1960s. But it's still the same paradigm, and remember, even Ron Dennis's playbook is now nearing 50 years old. That paradigm includes a lot of work after the sponsorship sale, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about no free lunch. There is also no such thing as free sponsorship. Teams have to work very hard to sell their image to sponsors in the hopes this will allow them to break even on track, let alone turn a profit. Sponsors, rightly, expect something in return, and the whole team, from the drivers to the engineering department to the logistics team, has to pitch in above and beyond their race duties to deliver on their end of the bargain. Then, if a sponsor goes under or wants to spend their marketing budget elsewhere, racing teams have to start the process all over again. Generally speaking, sponsorship creates short-term lifelines but long-term weakness. And this is in the following ways. So first, there is short-term ROI obsession on both sides of the transaction. Teams want the money, sponsors want quick delivery and results. That's a lot of effort going into creating something so unstable. There's also fragility, as we've talked about. One lost deal can sink a season. And if you don't believe me, check out the episodes on Drive to Survive, where Gunther Steiner was running around trying to secure sponsorship for Haas. It really was, you felt sometime on a knife's edge as to whether he and they were going to make it or not. So fans have seen it time and again, teams folding overnight when a sponsor pulls out. And this is an F1, sure, but it's also in other racing series that, of course, aren't as prestigious. And then there's also a lost, or you could say maybe inadequate, connection with fans. I mean, do audiences really connect with disparate logos around a car? What about in less known motorsport series? Because you can make a case in F1, but what about those in which the fan base might be a bit more diffuse? People don't connect with unfamiliar logos, but they can connect with teams, drivers, and stories. And this is going to be a key point I'm going to elaborate on further on in the series. Now, if you don't believe that, have you honestly never gotten really engrossed in a documentary that was so well done it pulled you into a world you had no idea existed? That's the power of well-produced storytelling. And yet, teams continue to outsource their survival to external brands. And so what all of this calls for is a new paradigm, one in which teams are far more dependent on their own efforts than the whims of sponsors. What I'm talking about here is moving from marketing platforms to content platforms. At all levels of motorsport, teams are still trapped as marketing platforms because their value is measured by how well they can sell other companies' products. And of course, that is done through sponsorship. That has worked well, even taking people like Zach Brown to the very top of the racing pyramid after he founded a company called JMI, a firm which professionalized the sale of sponsorships. But to me, the next revolution is clear. Tomorrow's motorsport teams, the ones that are really successful in moving away from sponsorship as a way of totally funding their operations, well, they must become content platforms. They must leverage their intellectual property, heritage, and brand identity to build self-sustaining revenue streams, merchandising, storytelling, experiences, and cultural collaborations. And I'll cover more examples of those further on in the series. And the goal is going to be reducing reliance on external sponsors. Other sports, such as basketball, football, and skateboarding, have excelled in these areas. And if you need convincing, consider these examples of how icons in these respective areas have become cultural touchstones. Of course, in basketball, there's Michael Jordan, the Jordan brand, and the Jumpman logo. Then, in football, there's the powerhouse video game that is Madden. And consider this, the NFL and EA made a legend out of a coach. Could motorsport do the same today out of a team principle? I'm not just talking about pulling sound bites out of Drive to Survive. I mean, really make an icon. Then in skateboarding, the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series contains quite literally some of the highest rated and beloved games in history. They hold a special place in the hearts of an entire generation, mine included. And to be honest, I'm not even a skateboarder, and many people that have played and loved the games are not either. And yet, setting Tony Hawk's Pro Skater aside, that is still only one tiny sliver of the impact that skateboarding has had on global culture. These sports have reached escape velocity beyond their respective fan bases by leaning on storytelling, merchandising, and cultural capital. And motorsport, as much as it might try to convince you otherwise, is still basically chasing logos. So, what if motorsport teams stopped seeing themselves as billboards and started seeing themselves as creators of culture and intellectual property? I want to repeat that again: creators of culture and intellectual property. The best analogy for the current situation in motorsport is that basically every team operates on a salary basis. They have to work for sponsors in return for money and keep repeating the process to keep the lights on. If the company goes under or fires their employee, that's the race team, well, that's trouble. You probably know the frustration with this type of relationship, and it's this frustration that has led so many entrepreneurs to strike out on their own, creating something over which they have ownership. The work to do so is incredibly difficult, but the end result is theirs. And more importantly, once it's out in the world, its value is no longer tied to the amount of hours worked. My hypothesis is that the opportunity is huge and it's truly available to teams in all series of all sizes, not just F1, because almost no one has even scratched the surface of what is possible. And here are just a couple of examples that I'll elaborate on as we move through this multi-part series. So first, there's technology and core competency spinouts. This is an obvious first choice for an industry built on cutting-edge tech, and this has already been done. It's being done, and appropriately enough, McLaren and Ron Dennis were some of the first to do it. Then there is merchandise and lifestyle products, and this is not just caps and polos, but actual identity pieces. I've written a lot about this already. I'll link to that article in the show notes. But in this case, you want to think Jordan brand, not team shop. There is a big difference between the two. Then there's storytelling and content. And crucially, this is not just about short clips for TikTok. There's plenty of that. And some of it's actually pretty entertaining, but it comes and goes very quickly. What I'm talking about are truly cinematic videos utilized for storytelling and myth making. And in part 2 of this series, I'll cover one specific example because it popped into my head immediately. And I think once you hear about it, you'll agree as well. The next opportunity would be in experiences and spaces. Now, yes, some of the bigger F1 teams have already started to do this, but there's plenty of opportunities to do it down the Motorsport series ladder. And here's what I'm talking about: garage bars, immersive air-themed fan houses, and sim racing hubs. The limits are really only creativity and the willingness to try new things. And then there are cultural collaborations. This seemed to start with Lewis Hamilton and then kind of died off. But this is the holy grail of brand building: fashion, music, art collabs, anything cool that resonates and that places teams in the wider cultural conversation. And this is something skateboarding has done so well, because a lot of the times skateboarding was what influenced the culture, and in turn that culture reinforced skateboarding. And it's that virtuous cycle that I hope motorsport teams can create. So as I've said, other industries have proven the model, and despite some discrete examples here and there, motorsport is far behind. What's even more shocking is that there are creators out there already experimenting, creating cool stuff featuring motorsport as the backdrop. It's out there. I follow many Instagram accounts where people are making awesome stuff that maybe actual teams don't know about, or they just feel like they're too scared to try it because it's a bit too avant-garde. But I think it's fantastic, and it's already out there. So the creative work exists, the talent exists. Motorsport teams just need to listen, look, and bring their resources and official licenses. If you're not an F1 team, this lack of great motorsport intellectual property is actually good news, because if you start your efforts now, you have a very good chance of making a big impact, far more so than if you wanted to, say, launch a brand aimed at skateboarders. Now, to be very clear, and to repeat something I said up front, every team in every series will not magically have to stop cold calling sponsors because they made a nice video or two. However, this is about something complementary. It's about diversifying your revenue streams, as we might talk about in personal finance. So for those teams with a goal and a game plan, at the very least, this could cut down on some of that cold calling. And who knows, with an increased profile and a dynamic audience, potential sponsors may eventually be calling those motorsport teams. So they get a double positive effect. They get the increased revenue and attention and influence that comes with developing their own IP, and they get the sponsorship revenue on top of that. As I've said, this is such a huge topic that it needs to be broken down into several parts. This series on moving away from sponsorship to intellectual property that motorsport teams, not their respective series, that's crucial, can monetize, we'll cover. the league that provides the blueprint for epic storytelling. That'll be part 2. Part 3 will be the cultural elements that must be in place for motorsport to reach that critical escape velocity outside of its fan base and perhaps even create a transcendent icon. So, can motorsport have its own Michael Jordan? And then finally, I want to end the series with part 4. It's going to cover examples of how motorsport teams can creatively generate buzz and become intertwined with popular and youth culture. So, stay tuned. And on that note, I want to thank you, as always, for taking the time to join me here on Return on Racing. If you like these insights and you want to hear more delivered directly to you, please consider signing up for the Return on Racing newsletter. You can do that either by navigating to the front page of the Vaucher Analytics website, or there'll be a link to do that in the show notes. And the idea is to deliver quick hits of insights to you, always in less than 500 words, that you can apply directly to your motorsport operations. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join me here on Return on Racing, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode where we'll cover part 2 of this really exciting series. Thank you so much.